So just show of hands, how many people know the significance of the date September 11th, 2001? Yeah, I was in my early 20s at the time. They said that when you saw what was going on in the news, that you would always remember where you were when it happened. Who can remember what that event was? Like, who just yell it out?
The towers.
Yeah, the Twin Towers were struck by airplanes when Islamic extremists flew them in there. And who knows about approximately how many people died that day? Yeah, in the back.
Rounding up 3,000.
Yeah, around 3,000 people, approximately. I was working at a casino at the time. I was driving in on my way to work when the Twin Towers actually went down. And I got into work. I was a few minutes early, so I went into the break room to just kill some time before my shift began, and they were showing it on the news. Now, I'm here to talk about the issue of abortion. And this is a significant issue because if pro-life people are wrong about what abortion actually does, then we're trying to take away a fundamental reproductive right from women, and that's tragic. But if pro-life people are correct, that human life does begin at fertilization, and abortion is wrong because it takes an innocent human life, then we're killing unborn children to the tune of about 3,000 every day, 9/11 every day, due to abortion, and that's tragic. So no matter which side of the aisle that you fall on, whether you're pro-life or you're pro-choice, it's a significant issue. Now, I had a little more in my bio prepared, but just suffice it to say that I'm a full-time pro-life advocate. I've been involved in the pro-life movement for about 7 years, going on 8 years. And I've studied the issue intensely, and so I have a pretty good working knowledge of the field of the abortion issue. And so what I'm here to do today is I'm here to present the pro-life case, and I'm going to be looking at some arguments for the permissibility of abortion as well. And I'm going to show why I believe the pro-life case is strong and the pro-choice case doesn't work. And so I'm going to do this in 3 steps. I'm first going to present a positive case for the pro-life position. Now, a positive case is where you argue in favor of something, and a negative case is where you respond to criticisms of your position. So I'm first going to present 2 positive cases for the pro-life position. I'm first going to look at the science of embryology and show why the science of embryology shows that human life begins at fertilization. And then my second step is I'm going to look at the philosophy of the abortion issue and show why, philosophically, we can be sure that human personhood begins at fertilization, that the unborn are human persons through all stages in their life. And then my third step is going to be looking at some of the abortion choice arguments. And I'm going to show why, especially since the pro-life position, I would argue, is so strong, why the pro-choice position that I'm going to look at doesn't work. And Devin mentioned that I'm also going to be giving a talk on Thursday. It's going to be a little bit different than this talk. I'm actually going to be looking at the scope of pro-choice arguments. And so I'm not planning on giving an exhaustive look at the pro-choice arguments today. I'm going to actually save that for Thursday. I'm going to look at just about every type of pro-choice argument that they have to offer. So I'm going to look at just a few of the more common pro-choice arguments that we get. So just to reiterate my roadmap a little bit, I'm going to be looking at the scientific case for human life beginning at fertilization. Then I'm going to look at the personhood for why we know that human personhood begins at fertilization. And then I'm going to look at 3 types of pro-choice arguments and show why, especially in light of the pro-life arguments, the pro-choice arguments don't support the permissibility of abortion. So the first thing that we have to do when we ask ourselves whether or not abortion is permissible, there's one question that we have to answer. Do we have any gamers here with us today? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So some of you here will know what I'm talking about. Suppose you're in front of your big screen TV. You've got your Xbox on. You've got your Halo rocking. You've got your cold drinks over here. You've got your Cheetos over here. Your headset on. You're talking smack to your friends. When all of a sudden, little Timmy walks up behind you and taps you on the shoulder and says, "Mommy," or "Daddy, can I kill this?" Well, what's your first question going to be since your back is turned?
What is it?
What is it? Right. If he's got a cockroach, son, there's a time in every boy's life when you become a man. Go grab a hammer, don't tell your mother. If he's got the neighbor kitty by the throat, son, put him down. Old man Kenobi next door is not going to be happy about that. And if he's got his kid brother in a headlock, well, I'm going to recommend some counseling. So you can't answer the question, can I kill this, until you first answer a prior question. What is it? So obviously, as a pro-life person, I believe that what the unborn is a human being from fertilization. And I think that we have very good reason for supposing that it is. So first I'm going to look at the science of embryology. Now, it's actually scientifically uncontroversial that human life begins at fertilization. It's been known since the mid to late 1800s that biologically human life begins at fertilization. All embryologists without significant controversy agree with this biological point. In fact, it led Alan Guttmacher, who is the past president of Planned Parenthood, to write in a book in 1933 that this all seems so simple and evident that it's difficult to picture a time when it wasn't part of the common knowledge. So it's actually not a controversial claim to say that the relevant scientists, the embryologists, agree that human life begins at fertilization. Now, that's not a fallacious appeal to authority, because it's a consensus among the relevant scientists. But just for the sake of clarity and of really presenting my case well, I just want to go over real quick how we know that the science proves that point. Well, we know that from fertilization, the unborn is a living, human, individual organism. So there are four ways that we can address this issue. So first, we know that from fertilization, the unborn are alive. They exhibit the properties of living things. They metabolize food for energy, they respond to stimuli, they grow through cellular reproduction, and they maintain homeostasis. How many of you have had a biology class recently and know what homeostasis means? Yeah, okay, so it's basically just a fancy $5 term, meaning that it can regulate its own internal temperature to keep itself alive and maintain its systems and operations and things like that. So from fertilization, we know that it's alive because it metabolizes food for energy, it responds to stimuli, it grows through cellular reproduction, and it maintains homeostasis to keep itself alive. So there might be some debate about whether something that lacks one or more of these properties, like viruses, are alive. But there's no question scientifically that if something exhibits all of these properties, it's alive. So we know that the unborn are alive from fertilization, but we also know that they're human from fertilization. And we know this because they have their own unique human DNA signature. And we also know this because they're the product of human parents. And in general, living things reproduce after their own kind. Dogs produce dogs, cats produce cats, and humans produce human offspring. There's no point in human development that the unborn thing turns from something that's not human into something that is human. Biologically, it's human throughout all points of its development. So it's alive from fertilization, and it's human from fertilization, and we also know that it's an individual organism. Now, some people kind of falter on this point because it is connected to the mother's body by the umbilical cord. But the thing to keep in mind is that the umbilical cord is not what directs the embryo's development. The embryo itself directs its own development. The umbilical cord, what the purpose of it is to transport nutrients and oxygen to the body of the embryo to keep it alive. Just like we all need food and a proper environment to stay alive, but we're still individual organisms. So we know that the unborn is an individual being because it directs its own development. It's not the mother's body that directs it. In fact, there's actually a scientific study that was published early last year, which actually argued quite strongly that the embryo is a fully autonomous individual organism from fertilization. And then fourth, we know that it's alive, we know that it's human, we know that it's an individual, and we also know that it's an organism. We know that it's an organism because because it's alive and it regulates its own temperature and all of these things, and we know that it also develops itself from within into a more mature version of itself. So through all points in its development, it's the same individual organism. Biologically, it's the same individual through all points in its life. So the scientific evidence points to the fact that human life begins at fertilization. And again, this is something that is not contested by the relevant scientists. So once we have the science out of the way, now we can look on to the philosophy. And there are a few different arguments that I'd like to present. One is a little bit more philosophical and heady. It's okay if you don't really track with it, because it might be the first time you've heard any of these concepts. I really just want to inform you that the argument is out there, and I'd encourage you to look into it some more if you have time or the desire. And then I'm going to look at a couple more which are a little bit easier to follow the first time that you hear. And now that I'm a public speaker, I know what Marco Rubio is going through when he. Oh, no one was. Okay, I guess. Sorry, no one got that reference. Okay, that's okay. Yeah. Okay. So the first argument that I'd like to present so we talked about the science that human life biologically begins at fertilization, but now I want to talk about the philosophy. How do we know that even though it's a human being from fertilization, how do we know that it has a serious right to life? How do we know that it's the kind of thing that we should protect and not kill? Well, a positive argument that we have for this is what's called the substance view. And this is an argument that it goes back to Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, but there are modern philosophers who defend this point of view, such as Frank Beckwith, Ed Feser, and David Oderberg. So the substance view it is a little bit complicated, but I'll try to keep it understandable. So everybody, just go ahead and picture in your minds a car. Because that car is going to be important for the entirety of this argument. You can picture something, maybe the car you drive, or maybe a Ferrari. That's not the car I drive. That's the kind of car I'd have to work 5 years just to make one payment on. So picture in your mind a car. Now, in nature, there are 3 different kinds of organization that we find. And they all exist in more complex forms of organization. So the first thing that we have is what's called a heap. So a heap is just a collection of stuff. And it only has a very weak kind of organization in that all of its parts are spatially located near each other. That's the only real kind of organization it has. So a heap is a hunk of stuff, kind of like a pile of salt or a hunk of metal. So if we're thinking of our car, then that hunk of metal, which is going to go in to make the car, is a heap. It's just a heap of scrap metal, basically. So next up, a more complex kind of organization is what we call an artifact. And now an artifact is an artificially constructed thing, like a car. A car would be considered an artifact. And then more complex than that is what we would call a substance. And a substance is any naturally occurring thing. So we usually think of living things as paradigm examples of substances, but even things like rocks can be considered a substance. But just for our purposes, we're going to be looking at living things since we're talking about the topic of abortion. So we have artifacts, which are artificially constructed things, and then we have a substance, which is a naturally occurring thing, something that maintains its identity through change. And now I should point out, because I talked about this concept once to a group in New Mexico, and one girl in the audience kind of got offended because I'm referring to human beings as substances. And I just want to make it clear that by calling humans a substance, I'm not dehumanizing them at all or denigrating them. I'm the guy, trying to defend the unborn here, so obviously I'm not going to try to dehumanize anybody. But all that a substance is philosophically is just an entity that maintains its identity through change. So that's all I mean by a substance. I don't intend to just call a human being, just like a hunk of flesh or something. That's not what I mean by the term. Okay, so so we have a substance then, and so the difference. There are actually a lot of differences between an artifact and a substance, but there are 2 that are important for our discussion. That number one, an artifact, and this is going to involve another kind of $10 philosophy term. I'll define what it means. So an artifact, we would say that the parts are ontologically prior to the whole. And all that means, it actually means a couple of things. That number one, the parts of an artifact exist before the whole does. So you have the hunk of metal, which can go in to make the car. But it also means that the parts have metaphysical priority over the car, or over the whole, meaning that the parts are what determine what the whole is. So when you construct a car, you construct it from that pile of scrap metal. And so you put the tires on, you put the frame down, all of these things go in to make the car. All of the individual parts have an individual function, and once you finish that car, then the car is actually meant to function in a certain way. And if it looks like a car, but it doesn't function in a certain way, say you just have an old clunker out in your front yard. I was going to say living room, but why would you have a car in your living room? Say you have just an old clunker out in your front yard. Well, if it looks like a car, but it can't get you from point A to point B, if it can't do what a car can do, which is to transport persons and objects from point A to point B, then it's just a car in name only. It's not a car in any meaningful sense. So an artifact, its parts have metaphysical priority over the car. Its parts are what determine the artifact's nature and its individual functions that it can perform. A substance is different. In a substance, it's actually the reverse. The whole is ontologically prior to the parts, meaning that the whole of the substance is what determines what the substance actually is and what sorts of functions that it can perform. So, for example, if we take the unborn human being, once the sperm and the egg merge and come into existence, then they both cease to exist, and a new genetically distinct human organism is formed. So that means that this human being now is, being a substance, the whole of it is ontologically prior to its parts. So the whole, its underlying nature is what determines what kind of parts it will develop and what sorts of things that it will be able to do later on. And so we call these things capacities. So, for example, a human substance has the capacity to speak a language. It has the capacity to engage in rational thought, to be conscious. All of these things, which it will be able to do later on down the road. It has all of these capacities, but it has it sort of inherently at a latent level. It's not able to perform them just yet. It needs time to develop in order to be able to perform these functions according to its underlying nature. So that's one important difference between an artifact and a substance. Another important difference between the two is that in an artifact, if you swap out one of its parts, then it no longer remains the same thing. So, for example, if you have a car, if you have like a nice, going back to the Ferrari example, I'm not particularly fond of Ferraris. I don't know why I keep returning to that particular car, but if you so much as just swap out the hood ornament of a car, then it's no longer the same thing that it was before, and it's going to lose its value. A collector is not going to pay nearly as much money as it would if you swapped out the hood ornament as he would if you had the original hood ornament intact. And that's because the car itself is not the original car. It's had one of its parts swapped out. And we can kind of see that from a more extreme example too. And this is an example that a Christian apologist named J. Warner Wallace once used. There's a more philosophical example, but I'm using this one because it relates to cars, and I want to keep the example, keep us all tracking by using the car as the example. So suppose I have a brand new nice car in my front yard, and my neighbor has an old dilapidated car in his yard. And it's the same car, the same type of car, except that mine's brand new, it's nice. My neighbor's is old and dilapidated. So suppose, unbeknownst to me, because for some reason I'm just the least observant person in the world, every night while I'm asleep, my neighbor starts swapping out parts from my car with his. And now, like I said, I'm the least observant person in the world, so this continues on until my neighbor has actually swapped every piece of my car with every piece of his, so that now I have an old and dilapidated car in my yard, and my neighbor now has a brand new car in his yard. So the question then becomes, well, which car is the original car? Well, I think certainly the old dilapidated one I have now is not the original car. It seems like it's very plausible that the car that is in my neighbor's yard, the brand new one with all the new parts, is the original car. And if I were to say, I want my car back, I would have to go to my neighbor and say, hey, you took my car, I want it back. So when you swap out the parts of an artifact like a car, you no longer have the same car that you had before. But a substance is different. A substance, if it loses its parts, it retains its identity. So, for example, if I were to, God forbid, if I were to lose my arm in an industrial accident, I would still remain the same thing. My identity would not change. I would still be the same person I was before I lost the arm. I would just now be a person who was missing an arm, essentially. But I would still be me. I would still be the same person. So now this is relevant to the abortion issue because a lot of pro-choice people especially, tend to get it in their minds that the unborn are sort of constructed piece by piece like cars on an assembly line. They think, it's not the fact that the embryo is developing from fertilization, but that it's sort of having all of its pieces added on. And they kind of get this idea that the unborn are kind of like those cars. And so it can be kind of difficult to know when you have a car because cars are constructed piece by piece. But the unborn are different. The unborn are more like Polaroid photos. Now, I don't. Some of you are probably a bit younger than I am. Do you know what those Polaroid cameras are? Yeah, okay. Because they were pretty popular when I was a kid back in 19. So to those of you who are not in the know, they're kind of making a comeback now. But a Polaroid camera is a camera where you take a picture and a piece of plastic comes out the camera. And you kind of have to give it a few minutes. But it starts as a little brownish gray smudge, and the picture that you took develops from that brownish gray smudge on this piece of plastic. So imagine, if you will, that you're out on holiday in Scotland with your buddy, and you're on a rowboat on Loch Ness. You're out there having a good time, and all of a sudden, up from the water comes Nessie, the Loch Ness monster. You motion to your friend, quick, grab me my camera. And your friend just kind of rolls his eyes because you haven't yet made the leap into the 21st century, and he hands you this old dinosaur, the camera, not the monster. You snap the picture, the monster submerges, never to be seen again. So the piece of plastic comes out the camera, and there you are, giggling like a schoolgirl, when your friend looks at it and says, oh, bummer, man, your picture didn't come out. So he takes it from you, he rips it up, and he throws it overboard into the lake. Now, you'd be justifiably upset, right? You'd want to throttle your friend. Your friend just ripped up that $10,000 photograph you were going to sell to the National Enquirer. But your friend incredulously says, what is the matter with you? That was just a brownish gray smudge. I cannot fathom why you care so much about brownish gray smudges. But that wasn't the point. The point is that the picture was there. You just didn't have the ability to see it yet. Well, the unborn are similar. The unborn are not constructed piece by piece like cars on an assembly line. They develop themselves from within, like that Polaroid photo. Everything that unborn organism is going to be, and already is present right from the very beginning. It just needs... I'm sorry? Oh, okay. I must be hearing things. It just needs time, proper nutrition, proper environment, and a lack of fatal threats in order to be able to develop all of it. So, in a nutshell, the substance view shows that if the unborn are substances, that is, that they're entities that maintain their identities through change, then all of the changes that the unborn embryo went through from the single-celled zygote stage, through all of these changes, developing body parts, developing a beating heart, developing a brain that functions, all of these changes are not changes that change the nature of the unborn organism into one thing that's not a human person, into something else that is a human person. All of these changes are within that individual organism's internal programming to undergo. And since all of these changes are within that organism's internal programming, the organism remains the same thing throughout all of its changes, which means that you did not come from an embryo, you once were an embryo. And so that's the substance view, and that's the first philosophical argument that I have. It's also the most complicated one. So if you're a little tired from that one, we'll give these next two a shot here. So the next argument that we have is what's called the sled argument. Now the sled argument was developed by I want to say it was Greg Kokel, but it might have been Scott Klusendorf. They both work closely. Yeah. Sled. SLED, yeah. Yeah, so SLED is an acronym, and it stands for size, level of development, environment, I almost forgot how to spell, environment, and degree of dependency. So the idea behind the SLED test is that we can look at the unborn organism, and obviously the unborn organism is a lot different from the infant and from the adult that it will one day become. But none of these changes were substantial changes. That is, none of these changes were changes that developed this unborn organism from one thing into something else. So what are these major changes that the unborn organism goes through? Well, the first one is size. That's the S in SLED, size. The unborn are certainly a lot smaller than the infant, the adult that it will one day become. But size is not an accurate way to judge someone's value as a human being. Women are generally smaller than men, but that doesn't mean that they're less valuable than men, right? Careful here, fellas. No, of course not. Gary Coleman is not less valuable than Shaquille O'Neal, who's basically a human tank, just because there's a size difference there. So size is not an accurate way to determine human value. Next is level of development. Well, the unborn are certainly less developed than the infant or the adult that it will one day become. But is this an accurate way to test human value? Well, again, no, because we don't assign value based on level of development. If we did that, then essentially human value would exist as a bell curve. You would start with no value as you began life without basically any development. You would have no value, and then as you gain development, you would gradually gain in value until you hit your intellectual peak until sometime around your mid-20s, and then you would start losing human value as you started to lose your abilities as you got older and got to be in the elderly phase. But of course, we know that human development does not exist as a bell curve. It seems like all of us are equally valuable, and so if we're equally valuable, then it can't be grounded in something that comes in degrees, basically, like our development does. So just because something is less developed does not mean that they're less valuable than things that are more developed, especially if they're the same kind of thing. So the E in SLED stands for environment. Well, the unborn are certainly differently located than we are. They exist in the womb, whereas we exist outside the womb. But how does that short trip down the birth canal change the nature of the unborn organism into something that's not a human person, into something that is? As my boss Scott Klusendorf asks, why does where you are determine what you are? Well, it seems like it doesn't. A couple of years ago, I flew to England from Fresno, California. That's a trip of about a little over 8,000 miles. But I didn't change who I was just because I took that long trip. Nor do I change who I am whenever I roll over in bed, which is a much shorter distance. So just coming out into the world through the birth canal does not change the nature of that unborn organism into something that was not a person into something that is. Finally, there is degree of dependency. The unborn are certainly more dependent than we are. But again, is degree of dependency an accurate way to test human value? Well, again, obviously we would say no. Teenagers and adolescents are more dependent on their parents than I am, and then all of us here are. I mean, we can drive ourselves places. We can generally feed ourselves because we can work, or we can go to college and get financial aid. All of these things that we do that can earn us money that can basically help us feed ourselves. And so we're less dependent than teenagers and adolescents are, who are more dependent on their parents. But again, that doesn't make teenagers and adolescents less valuable as human beings than we are. So these four changes, size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency, are all differences between the unborn and us. But none of these changes justify being able to kill one and not kill the other. So that's the SLED test. And our last argument is what's called the equal rights argument. And this one is just basically an argument that shows that whatever it is that grounds equal rights, if we're going to say that, for example, if all of us should be treated equally, or at least in terms of whether or not we should have the right to kill each other, if all of us deserve to be treated equally, well, we have to find what that is that grounds our need for equal value. And so whatever property it is that we ground our equal value in, it has to be something we have equally. It can't be something that comes in degrees. Otherwise, human value would be a degreed thing itself. So obviously, an abortion choice person is going to raise some different types of arguments, and I'll get to those in just a second when I address the pro-choice arguments. But for the pro-life person, we would say that the only thing that we have equally is our humanness, our human nature. If it's our humanness that we all have equally, and if the unborn share in that humanness, well then, if my human rights are grounded in the fact that I'm a human, and the unborn are humans, then they also have human rights. Their human rights are also grounded in the fact that they're human. So we don't ground human rights in anything else like our self-awareness or our consciousness. So the equal rights argument basically comes in three questions. The first question is, do we all deserve to be treated equally? I think most of us would agree, yeah. The second question is, well, doesn't that mean that there's something that's the same about us? Again, yeah, that seems to make sense. And so the third question then is, what is it that's the same about us? So if it's our humanness and the unborn share in that humanness, then the unborn have human rights as well and deserve protection and not being killed. Okay, So that was the last philosophical argument, the last positive argument that I have for the pro-life position. So I talked about the science of embryology to show that human life begins biologically at fertilization, and then I talked about the philosophy to show that the unborn are persons from fertilization, and there's been no substantial change that could change the unborn organism from one thing that's not a human person into something that is a human person. So now, what about the arguments that that abortion choice people raise? Well, again, I'm going to be talking about these more in depth on Thursday, and so if you want the full scoop, I would encourage you to come and attend our period then. But I am going to talk about some of the more common abortion choice arguments that we hear. And I'm actually going to be talking about 3 different types of arguments that an abortion choice person raises. The first type of argument is one that I would call a question-begging argument. If those of you have taken a logic class, you'll know what question-begging means, but I'll explain it in just a moment. These are basically arguments from situations. The second type of argument I'm going to address are bodily rights arguments. And the third type of argument I'm going to address are personhood arguments, arguments that the unborn are not actually persons because they lack some property that we have. And so since they lack the property that grants equal rights, they don't have equal rights to us. So the first type of argument I'm going to address are what we call the question-begging arguments. And so question-begging is just a logical term, meaning that you're trying to assume what you're trying to prove. So these kinds of arguments are not arguments that argue that the unborn are not human beings or human persons. They're arguments that assume it without arguing for it. And especially since I just laid out a case for the pro-life position that we're human from fertilization and that we're persons from fertilization, then the abortion choice person who wants to justify abortion has to do better than simply assuming that the unborn are not human or human persons. They have to actually make a case for it. So these arguments usually take the form of circumstances. And we generally agree, we can find common ground that yes, these circumstances are difficult. But the question is, are they the kinds of circumstances that would justify killing an unborn human being? So for example, let's take the situation of poverty. Some people argue that many women are just too poor to afford a child, and so they need abortion to survive, essentially. Well, the question then becomes, if they haven't made a case that the unborn are not human persons, then is abortion justifiable in the situation in which a woman feels that she can't afford a child? Well, to investigate this question, we can use a technique that was developed by Scott Glusendorf of Life Training Institute. It's called Trot Out the Toddler. What we do is we imagine now, instead of dealing with an unborn child, now we're actually dealing with a toddler. And we use the same situation to see if we can justify killing the toddler for this kind of situation. So we can affirm that poverty is definitely a very difficult situation, and we should want to help a single mother in any way that we can to get out of the situation. But is abortion an appropriate response to poverty? Well, now instead of an unborn child, let's talk about a toddler. If we had a toddler and a woman is in the same situation, she just lost her job, and maybe her husband or her boyfriend walked out on her from the situation, would we then allow her to kill her toddler because of poverty? Well, obviously we wouldn't. And the reason for that is because the toddler is a human being. So the question then becomes, if the unborn human being is as valuable a human being as that toddler, then can we justify killing the unborn human being for that situation? And so, of course, the response again would be no. If the unborn human being is as valuable a human being as the toddler, then we can't justify abortion for that situation because we couldn't justify it to kill a toddler. So this argument doesn't make a case for the pro-life position. I already did that before. But what this argument does is it actually brings out the logical fallacy that the pro-choice person is committing, and that's that they're assuming that the unborn is not a human being. So that's not the end of the job for the pro-life person. Obviously, they haven't made a case if all they're doing is showing that we have a comparable situation here. But what it does do is it helps the person that you're talking to realize that they're not making a case for abortion. They're assuming that it's a moral thing to do without even arguing for it. And so another situation, these circumstantial situations are all generally the same, that they're assuming basically that abortion is legal. So other situations like, she wants to be able to continue going to college, or maybe even we feel the world is overpopulated, so we need abortion to survive. Well, again, none of these situations are situations we would justify killing a toddler for. So we need to have that discussion of, is the unborn a human being? Is it a human person? Before we can justify abortion in these situations. So these are the question-begging pro-choice arguments. There are stronger arguments that pro-choice people make. So first I'm going to address now the bodily rights arguments. And bodily rights arguments can come in a few different flavors. I'm just going to illustrate the two most popular ones. And so we credit Trent Horn, who's a pro-life advocate, with coming up with this distinction between bodily rights arguments. That there are basically two different kinds of or two major kinds of bodily rights arguments. You have your sovereign zone arguments, which is the argument that a woman has the right to do anything she wants to anything inside her body. And the other kind of bodily rights argument is an argument that was illustrated by Judith Jarvis Thomson in an essay in 1972, I believe, in her essay, A Defense of Abortion. And that's the right to refuse argument, that a woman should not be forced to remain plugged in as life support to the unborn human being. So first let's address what's called the sovereign zone arguments. And this is usually not a term you hear from the person making the argument, but it's sort of the same idea, that her body is a sovereign zone, so she has the right to do anything that she wants with anything inside her body. So there are a few different scenarios that we can raise to show that this is not an idea that holds water. And we can go pretty in depth. We can go pretty dark with it if we have to. But I'm not going to go all that way, because the first couple of situations should be enough to show any reasonable person that this is not something that we can justify. So the first thing we can say is that if a woman's body is a sovereign zone, and she has the right to do anything she wants with anything inside her body, well, that means that any sort of abortion would be permissible. That means if she's 9 months pregnant and wants to fly overseas or wants to ride the roller coasters at Disneyland, we might find them distasteful, but she has the right to have those kinds of abortions. Or if she really wants a boy, but she's having a girl, she can have an abortion to try again to get a boy. And the problem with these scenarios is that Gallup polls have shown that most people, including pro-choice people, do have some restrictions on abortions. Most people believe that sex selection abortions are wrong. Most people believe that frivolous abortions are wrong, like wanting to ride the roller coasters at Disneyland. And most people even agree that late-term abortions are wrong. But if the woman's body really is a sovereign zone, then all of these abortions would be permissible, even if we would never have them ourselves. Another way that we can go with it is we can show the example of thalidomide. And those of you who are unfamiliar with that, it's a cancer treatment drug. And back in the 50s and 60s, they started prescribing it to treat morning sickness in women. And so we can say, okay, so suppose a woman is having really bad morning sickness during one of her pregnancies, and she wants to obtain some thalidomide and take it. Should she have the right to take thalidomide, even knowing that there's a chance that it might cause a birth defect, or actually it's a pretty good chance that it'll cause a birth defect because she wants to ease morning sickness? Well, if her body is a sovereign zone, then we would have to say that yes, it's permissible for her to do so, even though it's going to leave the fetus or embryo severely deformed. And if that's not enough to convince somebody, well, we can take it a step further. We can say, okay, so suppose she took thalidomide during one pregnancy and had a severely deformed child. So she really enjoyed the accolades, and she enjoyed everybody thinking what a wonderful and brave person she was. So she wants to go through it again, and now she takes thalidomide to intentionally damage her unborn child. Is that something that we should allow as permissible? If this sovereign zone idea is successful, then yes, it's something that would be permissible. But I think most of us would understand that no, that's not something that she should have a right to do. And if she doesn't have a right to do that, then this idea that her body is a sovereign zone falls flat. It fails. Because obviously she doesn't have the right to just do anything she wants with anything inside her body. And now someone who's taken like a first-year philosophy class and fancies himself, the next René Descartes or something, might try to go even further. Yes, I think she should have that right. Well, we can go to even darker scenarios, which I'm not going to go into tonight. But those three scenarios, I think, should be enough to show reasonable people that this idea of a sovereign zone is not a good way to argue for abortion, because it just doesn't work. So the other type of bodily rights argument is what we call the right to refuse argument. And this is a much stronger argument because it makes a much weaker claim than the other one. It makes a more modest claim. All this argument claims is that a woman should not be forced to remain plugged in as life support for anyone, even an unborn child. And so Judith Jarvis Thomson's analogy goes like this. Suppose you wake up one morning and you're back to back in bed with a famous unconscious violinist. The curator of the hospital runs in and says, "Oh, you're awake. I'm terribly sorry, but this world-famous violinist is dying from a kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all possible donors and found that you're the only match. And so they kidnapped you, and they plugged you in by the kidneys to this violinist, and so you can't leave. But don't worry, it's only for 9 months, and then we can disconnect you, and you're free to go." So do we see how she's kind of drawing this as a parallel to pregnancy? You're connected to this unconscious violinist by the kidneys, and it's for 9 months, and you're needed to basically keep this violinist alive. And she even takes it a step further. She says, it may be the case that abortion is wrong, but should that then transfer to a legal obligation for her to remain plugged in as life support? So I think that her argument, even though it's much better than the other bodily rights argument, I still think it's not a very good argument. And again, there are a lot of disanalogies that I can draw between the two situations, but I'm only going to cover 3 which I think are the most important of the disanalogies. That number 1, in the case of pregnancy, we're dealing with a mother-child relationship. We're not dealing with a relationship of 2 strangers like we are in the violinist scenario. And it seems to me that a mother certainly has obligations to her child that a stranger doesn't have to another perfect stranger. So the parent-stranger objection, I think, shows why this argument doesn't work. Another is the responsibility objection, that you are responsible for the situation that the unborn child finds himself in. You willingly engaged in an act, which is the act of sex, which is how all of us who were conceived and born naturally, barring IVF procedures and those kinds of things. Most of us who were conceived naturally came into the world through the act of sex, and it's a consensual act. And since you had sex consensually, you then have a responsibility to the unborn child. But that's not the case in the case of the violinist. In the case of the violinist, you're not responsible for the condition the violinist finds himself in. Since you're not responsible for the condition the violinist finds himself in, you probably don't have an obligation to remain plugged in. And I say probably because I'm not convinced you wouldn't have that obligation. But just for the sake of argument, we'll say that you don't have the obligation to the violinist. And I would say that even if you don't have that obligation, that doesn't mean that you don't have that obligation to the child that you are responsible for bringing into the world and placing it in a needy condition upon your body. And then the third type of disanalogy between the two is the direct killing versus indirect killing obligation. In the case of the violinist, you are not directly responsible for his death if you unplug from him. The underlying pathology of the kidney ailment is what kills him. You are indirectly responsible, but you're not directly killing him. But in the case of abortion, in every abortion, you are directly responsible for killing the unborn human being. And I think that that distinction between directly killing someone and indirectly killing someone matters, because in one case, you are the active agent in the person's death. If you actively perform an abortion or have an abortion performed on you, you are the active agent in that person's death. Whereas in the violinist case, you are not the active agent, the kidney ailment is. So I think those 3 disanalogies show why the violinist situation doesn't work to justify abortion. And so finally, the last type of argument for abortion choice, for the permissibility of abortion I want to look at, are personhood arguments. And these are arguments that you find from philosophers like Peter Singer or Michael Tooley. And these kinds of arguments say that the unborn human being lacks some kind of property that we all have. And this property that they lack, but we have, is the property that grants our equal rights. And so I'm just going to look at a couple. There are a lot that are offered by abortion choice philosophers, but I'm just going to look at 2 right now because most of them suffer the same sorts of errors, essentially. There are other ways that we can address each individual one, but they all suffer from the same responses, basically. So the 2 that I want to look at are self-awareness and consciousness. So some philosophers will say, you're not a person unless you're self-aware, because you have to be able to see yourself existing through time. You have to be able to value your own life in order to be harmed by being deprived of it. And another property that they'll sometimes ground equal rights in is consciousness, for largely the same reason, because you have to be able to value your own life in order to be harmed by being deprived of it. Now, the problem with these kinds of arguments, the arguments that ground our equal rights in some property that we can perform, but that the unborn can't perform, is that, number one, it places the cart before the horse. Properties like self-awareness and consciousness are properties of persons. They're not properties that make persons. Saying that you must be self-aware or conscious in order to be a human person is as arbitrary as saying that you must be white or that you must be male to be a person, because grounding our value in gender or in skin color and gender are properties of persons, and so you're ignoring the underlying thing that we all have in common, which is our humanity. You're ignoring that, which is why it's wrong to ground our equal value in skin color or in our gender. For the same reason, it's wrong to place our value in a property like consciousness or self-awareness, because it's just as arbitrary. And the only reason that the unborn are not self-aware or conscious is because they're not old enough to be able to exhibit those properties yet. It's the underlying nature that grounds our ability to be self-aware and to be conscious. And since it's our nature that grounds these properties, and these properties are properties of persons, not the other way around, then trying to ground our equal value in some kind of property that we can perform, like I said, puts the cart before the horse. But another issue with it is that it commits what we call the episodic problem. Anytime you cease being able to perform these functions, such as when you fall asleep, or if you go under general anesthesia before a surgery, anytime you cease being able to perform these functions, you would then cease to be a person. But, I don't think you want to hold the position that we cease being a person if you cease being able to perform these functions. Because, what if you're going under general anesthesia before a surgery, but maybe, you looked at the doctor's wife askance, and he caught your glance. Well, if we lose our personhood when we go under general anesthesia, well, then that doctor would be perfectly justified in ending your life instead of giving you surgery if he doesn't like the way you looked at his wife. So I don't think we want to hold the position that you cease being a person every time you cease being conscious or self-aware, especially if you fall asleep. It's just not something that holds to reality. And so it's not our functions, again, that ground our equal rights. It's our underlying nature. That's the reason we don't cease being persons when we cease being able to function as persons, because our nature doesn't change from one point, from when we fall asleep to when we wake back up. So these are just two of the issues with functionalist arguments, such as placing our value in self-awareness or in consciousness. That it puts the cart before the horse. It basically confuses being a person with acting as a person, and it leads to the episodic problem. Okay, so those are the main abortion choice arguments that I wanted to address today. So I talked about the question-begging arguments, the ones from circumstances that assume what they're trying to prove, rather than arguing for what they're trying to prove. And then I took a look at the bodily rights arguments, the two of the major kinds, the sovereign zone and the right to refuse arguments. And then I looked at a couple of the functionalist arguments that the unborn are not a person because they're not self-aware and because they're not conscious. And so, for the reasons that I presented, I think that the pro-life position is a very strong one, and I think that the arguments for the permissibility of abortion just don't work, especially considering the fact that pro-life people do have the arguments for the fact that human life begins at fertilization and human person begins at fertilization. And I don't think that the attempts by abortion choice people to argue that we're not human or that we're not persons, I don't think those arguments are successful for the reasons that I have presented here and others. So before I close here today, I do have one other thing that I wanted to show. I actually do have a short video that I want to show, which actually does show the aftermath of abortion. The reason that I show this is not because I want to add any sort of emotionalism to my arguments, because I think that we can all agree, even if I haven't convinced you outright, I think we can all agree that I have at least presented arguments that have a rational foundation for believing, even if you're not necessarily convinced by them. And so that's why I tend to show these at the end, not at the beginning, because I don't want anybody to be swayed unnecessarily by emotion. And I also show it because I once gave a presentation in front of a philosophy class at Willow International College in Clovis, California, and I didn't show one of these videos because I wasn't sure how they take to it. And one of the girls in the class actually came up to me afterward and said that she wishes I had shown the video. So from that point on, I decided, okay, I'm going to go ahead and just show it, because the video that I'm showing, nobody has to watch. It's about a minute long, and there's going to be soft music playing, and you can turn your eyes. Nobody's going to judge you for looking away. I'm not going to scan the crowd to see who's looking or who's not. So don't feel obligated to watch. But I do think it's an important video to watch, because even though I think I've presented a good rational case for the pro-life position and against the abortion choice position today, sometimes actually seeing what it is that we're justifying can put the issue into a whole different frame. It can kind of make the case against abortion using very stark images that I could never make using words, essentially. And so again, don't feel obligated to watch, and I'm not showing this to condemn anybody who may be post-abortive, or who maybe has a friend who is post-abortive, or maybe you drove your friend in for an abortion or something. Because the reason that I do this is not to condemn anybody or make anyone feel guilty for past actions. What I want to do is I just want to help people make better decisions in the future. So that's why I'm here. And even though I've presented no religious arguments for my case today, I am a Christian, and I believe that even if you are post-abortive, or even if you did take someone in for an abortion, even though I would say that action was wrong, I think that there's forgiveness in Jesus Christ, and I think that that if you seek His forgiveness, that He'll be willing to forgive for any sin, which includes abortion, which is not definitely the unpardonable sin. So
after this video, 60 seconds, so feel free to look down, but then we're going to go to Q&A. So if you guys have questions, we want to hear your guys' questions. You guys can interact a little bit with Clint.
Yeah, and even after we're done with Q&A, if you want to come up and talk or continue the discussion, I don't bite, and if I do, I've had my shots. So yeah, feel free to come up, because this is something I do for a living, and so yeah, just if you're maybe a little bashful to ask a question in front of everybody, come find me afterward, and I'll be more than happy to engage. So yeah, so here's the video. Okay, thanks. Okay.
All right, let's move into a time of questions. And Clinton, when you get the question, just repeat it so we can make sure we get it on the microphone.
Okay, do we have people watching on the live stream also?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, if you're watching on the live stream, you can feel free to ask questions. I have Devin watching the live stream like a hawk, or like an eagle, I guess, since we're at Winthrop. And so he'll ask any questions in the live stream as well, so feel free to get your questions
guys,
in there.
We got plenty of pizza, cookies, soda, so help yourselves to that as well.
Yeah, we have a question in the back here.
And you didn't address it, but I'm sure you've heard this a zillion times. What if a woman gets pregnant because of rape? Why is abortion not justified in that scenario?
Yeah, that's a question that comes up often, and so it's always kind of a toss-up. Do I address it in the presentation, or do I just wait until it's asked at Q&A? Yeah, so the question that's being asked is, what about the situation of rape? Why wouldn't abortion be justified in that situation? And of course, the situation of rape is a very tragic, very traumatic situation, and I believe that that any woman who's raped needs proper counseling. In fact, there's an abortionist named Warren Hearn, who's actually one of the only late-term abortionists in the United States, who actually wrote a textbook called Abortion Practice. And in his textbook, he talks about how the abortion setting is not even appropriate for a woman who's been raped. She needs to be referred for proper counseling because having an abortion after she's been raped certainly isn't going to ease the trauma or make her feel better or anything like that. And so I can kind of answer this in a couple of ways, because first of all, I want to make sure that it's clear that I'm very sympathetic in these kinds of situations. I think that she needs proper counseling. I think we need to help her as much as we can, and I think that any rapist has done something that's severely wrong and needs to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. I say throw every book you can find at the rapist. So then the question then becomes, how does a civilized society treat a victim of a trauma? And so the way that I would see an abortion in the case of rape is that when we're dealing with an unborn human being, we're actually dealing with a second victim of the rape. Obviously there's the woman, because we can all see her, and she's going through a very, very difficult time, and that there's no doubt of that. But the problem is that if she becomes pregnant after she's been raped, well, now we have a second human being that we have to figure out what to do with. And so if we're just going to have that unborn organism killed, then it seems to me that we can certainly consider that to be a second victim of the rape, because the unborn human being has done nothing wrong. He's done nothing deserving of being killed. So it seems like what we're doing to that unborn human being is really unfair to that human being. And so it's very, very difficult, because we're pitting the woman who's going through a traumatic experience with the unborn human being who didn't ask to be there, who didn't commit the crime. So the question is, how do we treat victims of crimes in a civilized society? And it seems like in a civilized society, we punish the perpetrator of the crime. We don't punish the victim of the crime. And so I would say that abortion is not justified in the case of rape, even though it's a very traumatic situation. I don't think it's the proper course to basically help a rape victim. And I think that there's actually plausible reasons to suppose that it's not going to help her at all, because number one, if you do an abortion on a woman who's been raped, well, you're basically compounding one act of violence on top of another. And as we've seen from women who've come forward, many of them have said after they had the abortion that, I felt that the abortion was a lot worse than the rape. And number two, where the unborn human being that woman is carrying can actually, depending on her perspective of the situation, could actually be a source of healing, because we also have other women who've come forward and said the only good thing to come out of the rape was my child. So having an abortion is not going to make her unpregnant. It's not going to erase the trauma of the rape. She's always going to have that reminder. Many people say, well, she should have an abortion if she's been raped, because she's always going to have that reminder now of the child. But again, we don't justify killing people who remind us of traumatic events. And so I would say that number one, I don't think abortion is justified in the case of rape, because we are dealing with another human being. But I also don't think that it's necessarily the best thing for a woman, even though through her trauma, through the situation, it might seem like she wants it and like it is the best thing for her. I think in the long run, it could actually be seen as something that's even more harmful than good.
Going off of that, would the violinist argument though have ground if she was raped though, because this isn't a consensual act, so she isn't responsible for this person? Yeah, and this is why I kind of sometimes address this during the talk, because when I talk about the responsibility objection, obviously that doesn't hold in the case of rape. So that's why I actually address the responsibility objection second, and address the direct killing objection third, because I think that when we consider the direct killing versus indirect killing objection to the violinist scenario, I think that shows that we're not justified in
in doing the abortion on a woman who's been raped, because in that case we do have to directly kill a human being, and so we shouldn't kill a human being who's not the perpetrator of the crime. We should punish the rapist and not the second victim, which I would say is the unborn child. So I think in that case the direct killing versus indirect killing objection holds in the case of abortion as well. Yeah.
Just a comment. It seems like your argument, I forget what you called it. Was it toe out the toddler?
Oh, trot out the toddler.
Trot out the toddler.
Yeah.
That argument seems like it would play really well in this circumstance of rape.
Yeah. Oh, it would. Yeah, and yeah, I could have done that as well, because. Yeah, I don't know. I was trying to keep my response brief, but you're absolutely correct. We could actually use trot out the toddler in this situation as well, because so just to show how that would work. So suppose now we're no longer dealing with an unborn child, but suppose that a woman is raped and really wants to do the right thing and give this child a chance at life. 2 years after the child is born, the child starts taking on the features of the rapist, and now every time she looks at the child, she looks at it with hatred because it keeps reminding her of that rapist. So then the question becomes, are we now justified in killing that toddler because of the situation of rape? And so, of course, we would say no. And so it goes back to, if the unborn human being is just as human, just as valuable a human being as that toddler, then it seems like we shouldn't be able to have an abortion in the case of rape either. So yeah, so you're correct. Yeah, that could work in that situation also. Yeah.
What would you say in the situation of a woman is pregnant with a baby and the doctor tells her if you keep your child, you possibly lose your life or the baby lose their life? What would you say in that situation?
Okay, yeah, sorry, I was going to say, yeah, sorry, I've been forgetting to repeat the question. I'll repeat it this time. So the question was, what if we're dealing with a situation in which the mother's life is in immediate jeopardy, or the child is not going to survive being born, essentially? And so the way that I would respond to these, they're actually two different situations. I'll start with the fetal deformity first, because this kind of situation gets more into euthanasia. Do we believe that we're permitted to kill somebody if they're going to be suffering in the future? And so in this situation, I would say that I do, because I consider it wrong to kill an innocent human being. I would say that even in the case in which the human being is not going to be surviving much longer, I think that even in that case, we're not justified in killing the human, because I think that it's wrong to kill an innocent human being. But also, I think that there's another situation, especially if we're dealing with a situation of pregnancy in which there's some kind of severe deformity, for example, anencephaly, which is where the brain is outside the body. And most children who have anencephaly either spontaneously abort through miscarriage, or if they do survive to birth, they don't survive for more than a few days after birth. And I think even in that situation, that number one, the verdict is still out on when exactly the unborn can suffer pain in the womb. There's different answers depending on who you ask. But in a situation like anencephaly, almost certainly the child is incapable of feeling pain because of the severe deformity. So an abortion in that case is not sparing the child any sort of suffering. But there's an additional problem in that if you go through an abortion, if you kill the child prematurely, then you're actually robbing yourself of the experience of going through the death and having closure of that child who's dying. And so it seems like you're actually harming yourself. Just as you're harming the unborn child, you're robbing yourself of the closure and of being able to spend as much time as you can with a dying child, essentially. And so going to the situation now of when a woman's life is in immediate jeopardy, I think in that situation, if her life is in immediate jeopardy, I think that abortion is, I shouldn't say abortion is permissible, because I think that it's permissible to end the life, no, let me make sure I phrase this correctly. I think it's permissible to undergo a life-saving medical treatment. And so here's the difference. I think that in those situations, we can look at it like a case of triage for one thing. Like if we're talking about an ectopic pregnancy, an ectopic pregnancy is where the unborn organism implants someplace other than the uterus, and that's usually in the fallopian tube. And if allowed to continue developing, the fallopian tube is going to rupture, the mother is going to hemorrhage, and she'll most likely die. And so in that kind of a situation, we can look at it like a situation of triage. We have two patients that are in mortal jeopardy. It's only possible to save one, so you want to save the one that has the greatest chance of survival. So you want to save the mother's life, not necessarily the child's life. And then you have, other situations of which I think are similar as well. And so in this situation, I think it's permissible to save the mother's life because she has the greatest chance of survival. But I also think that we have to come up with an ethical way of ridding the body of the embryo, because again, I don't think it's permissible to kill an innocent unborn child. And so in this case, if we're dealing with, for example, an ectopic pregnancy, I think what you have to do in order for it to be ethically justified is you cannot directly kill the embryo, but you can act in such a way so that you're saving the mother's life, but the death of the embryo is not intended, but it is foreseen, and it's not directly caused. So, for example, there are a few different ways that an ectopic pregnancy might be resolved. One is through a drug called methotrexate, which you would take, and it would basically just cause the embryo to detach from the fallopian tube, and then the embryo would die. So that, I would say, would be an act of direct killing, because a direct act that you took, taking the pill, is resulting in the death of the embryo. So I think that would not be a permissible way to resolve the ectopic pregnancy. An ethical way, I think, would be to remove the offending section of the fallopian tube and remove it from her body, because in that case, the death of the unborn child is not intended, though it is foreseen. What's intended is to save the mother's life, and you're not directly killing the unborn child. You're the unborn child is basically dying because it's not in an environment in which it can survive. So in that situation, you're not intending the death of the embryo, though it is foreseen, and you're not directly killing the embryo. So I think in that situation, it can be ethically permitted to remove the embryo as long as you're not the one that's directly killing it. And so this is a situation which philosophers would call double effect reasoning, essentially. So I think through double effect reasoning, it can be justified. Yeah.
There's a book I read a long time ago, and you're talking more like some, like kind of almost like it was almost science fiction, but I don't admit it. It sounded really interesting and it sounds plausible to me. Is there any sort of science that shows long-term effects on the mother that does have abortion?
I mean, there have been studies done. I don't know what they are offhand. The question is, are there any studies that show the long-term effects of abortion on a mother who's gone through it? And yeah, there have been, and this is a little bit murky because we have studies which show that abortion has long-term health effects, and then you'll get abortion choice people who will actually argue tooth and nail that the studies don't show what pro-life people think it does. So there's a big argument about it. For example, we do have evidence that having an abortion does raise the risk of breast cancer later on in a woman's life, and there is evidence that shows a correlation between the two, and there is good medical reason to suppose that it does. But of course, Planned Parenthood and other abortion choice organizations would argue tooth and nail that there is no increased risk of breast cancer. And so I think the evidence, I don't think it's conclusive necessarily, but I think it does show that there is at least a possible correlation. And the way that I've heard it described, I think, is actually plausible as well. And I'll try to reproduce it here. Again, I'm not a medical doctor, but I have attended a seminar on the abortion breast cancer link, and the way that it was described to me is that there are certain cells inside a woman's breast called lobules, and when the embryo is conceived, they start as a very immature stage, and so once the child develops and is born and then goes through puberty, they become stage 2 lobules, and they need to become stage 3 in order to produce breast milk to feed the child. So once they're stage 2, that means that her body, because she's going through puberty, is getting ready to be able to get pregnant. And so in order for the lobules in her breast to fully mature, she has to undergo a pregnancy. And then the lobules will mature, and then she'll be able to produce breast milk to feed her child. If she undergoes a pregnancy, but she ends it prematurely through abortion, those lobules can't mature. And so they actually turn cancerous. And so that's why they argue that there's an increased risk of breast cancer, because those lobules in her breast are not able to fully mature, and they can become cancerous. And so that's the way that it was described to me. And so that means that even if a woman has a miscarriage, that can have an increased risk. But the fact that it's a natural miscarriage as opposed to an unnatural abortion means that it's less of a risk than if she has an abortion. But the risk is still there because they haven't been able to mature. So yeah, so that's the way that it was described to me at that conference that I attended.
I heard
so.
about that. I wasn't sure if there had been any official
There is, and so yeah, again, depending on who you ask, there is evidence that it causes harm, and there isn't evidence. But I think that the evidence is there that there are long-term risks of not just breast cancer, but other kinds of things too, and some they do cop to as well. You know, there is a risk, for example, of death during abortion. There have been women who've died from legal abortions because there's like a risk of perforating a uterus or some other health risk, and you know some other things as well. Like there is a potential that she might become sterile if the abortion is botched or something. So there are some health risks that pro-choice people will cop to, and others that they won't. So, yeah.
In all the research you've done, I'm guessing, and it's interesting that we have somebody from the Women's Center here too. But
Yeah.
I was wondering what your research has shown for people who, on the pro-choice side. It seems to me a common argument that I hear is there's no all of you Christians or you pro-life people that like to tell us that that you should be pro-life, but where are the resources to take care of this child and to help the mother, and they right. And so how do we better defend that? Are there statistics that we can bring to these people to say, you know, these women's centers have plenty of resources, or are they strapped? Are they, generally speaking, in the culture, just strapped and can't go and help all the needs that are, you know, if these 3,000 women per day are coming to these women's centers that are going to be pro-life, is there going to be resources there?
Yeah, and so there are statistics that we can bring. The last I heard that there's 2 pregnancy care centers in the United States for every 1 Planned Parenthood. So, and the problem is, Planned Parenthood will give you an abortion, but they're not going to give you, counseling if you want to keep the child, and they're not going to give you resources if you want to keep the child. In fact, in many cases, Planned Parenthood will actually refer out to a pregnancy care center. So, so I think just showing that Planned Parenthood isn't going to help, but we do have twice as many pregnancy care centers shows that we do care about women in these situations. It's just lazy slander to argue that we don't, because it's obvious to anyone who wants to look around that even if you don't agree with our arguments, you should at least be able to see that we do offer resources to help these women, especially with pregnancy care centers. And now, yeah, and of course you touch on an important thing too, is that pregnancy care centers, correct me if I'm wrong, often are not subsidized by the government or don't receive government grants. And so they operate based on donations from people. And so, pro-life people donate to these pregnancy care centers, and then they'll have the supplies to give to these pregnant women. So it is incumbent on all pro-life people too to donate to these pregnancy care centers. And I think we do a really good job of doing that. So yeah, I think it's just a way to avoid having to engage with the pro-life argument where they try to attack the character of pro-life people, which, in logic speak is another logical fallacy called the ad hominem. But yeah. So, yeah.
If we restrict abortion and it becomes successful policy on that part, would you engage other policies where you would support more subsidies for like women health centers because there were 3,000 women that they can't deny abortions, or like just saying that the 501c3s are not sufficient, and all that. Would you support subsidization?
You mean like government subsidies, that kind of thing? Yeah, okay, so the question is, if we do make abortion illegal, would I support government subsidies, tax breaks, and things like that? Okay, so I'll preface this by saying I'm not really a libertarian. But I do hold some things in common with libertarians, and one of those things is I don't believe that we should be taking money from people that we don't have any moral claim to or moral right to, and giving it to somebody else. So I'm a little bothered by that aspect of it, because people who earn their money, when the government takes it, they're basically taking money that the person, him or herself, has raised, and so I don't necessarily think that the government should be giving money to any organization within reason, like police or fire. I definitely don't think we should be giving it to Planned Parenthood, for one, because you're taking money from the taxpayer, many of which are pro-life, and giving it to Planned Parenthood, which do abortions. I would support tax breaks because you're letting them keep more of the money that they earned. But as for actually taking more tax money from people to give it to the pregnancy care centers, I'm a little bothered by that, because that's to me that's just stealing from the government, stealing from the taxpayer. I would be fine if there was like some kind of opt-in program, like, do you want some of your tax money to go to the pregnancy care centers, then yeah, great. I would fully support that as long as it's consented to by the taxpayer. But that's also why I think that I think all pro-life people have an obligation to donate to pregnancy care centers, because I think that they should do it willingly. I'm just a little bothered by the government forcing them to do it, is the only thing. So yeah, so within reason, I would support some government subsidies. Others I wouldn't. But because I don't think that we should be using tax money necessarily for it, I think that every pro-life person ought to be doing it of their own free will, because I think it's the right thing to do. And I think, I think that there's probably something, well, especially if they're not giving anything to charity at all, but I think that there's something wrong if a person is pro-life and doesn't want to help these women, especially with pregnancy care centers who aren't getting any sort of government grants or anything. So, yeah. Oh, do we have a question from the? Oh.
Can I just answer something to that?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
One thing I want to state is with the Pregnancy Resource Center, one of the great things about our organization is we have the ability to be that go-between. So we're not always the ones providing the resources that are overcoming these obstacles that women have who want to have abortions. It's multiple 501c3s in our community. And so we're just that one resource so women can come to us and we can make all of those connections. And so if there's 3,000 women a day throughout the United States decided they were not going to have abortions, there are enough medical organizations that can pick up the medical resources that women are receiving through Planned Parenthood today, as well as there are enough 501c3s throughout the organization that you wouldn't have to subsidize those organizations. So what would happen is the community would come together and they would make those donations.
Yeah.
But it's not just the Pregnancy Resource Center. We're just that one-stop shop that makes all those connections for everybody. The connections are already there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good thoughts. Definitely. Okay. So I had a question back here, and then I'll come over here.
I just kind of going off of what he said as far as abortion being illegal. I'm a criminal justice major, so it kind of had me thinking, well, should we have separate laws in place for unborn children? Should we hold all children or laws against children the same? Like, should a woman go to jail if her baby died because she neglected to take care of herself while she was pregnant?
Okay, yeah, so the question then is, if we make abortion illegal, how then should we treat women who have abortions or who may have been negligent in their pregnancies? And now, I'm not a criminal justice major, but it seems to me that when we're dealing with laws outside of the abortion issue, especially when we deal with laws relating to murder, it seems like we treat different kinds of killing in different ways. Because, for example, a premeditated murder is seen as worse than a crime of passion, and it's punished more severely. So the way that I usually respond to this is it's a little bit more complicated than it seems at first blush, because there are a lot of different situations that you have to take into consideration. You have to consider the frame of mind that she was in. Maybe she's not in her right mind, and then she needs psychological counseling, not jail time. Was she lied to by the abortionist? Did the abortionist say, "Oh yeah, we're just removing a clump of insensate tissue," whereas he's actually aborting a live fetus. In that case, she didn't have the knowledge going in of the full knowledge of what she was doing. And so there are a lot of different situations. I think that there are many women who know full well what they're doing. So I don't think that all women are necessarily in the boat of not having the full knowledge or not not being in the right mind, that kind of thing. Because I've encountered a lot of pro-choice people who are very adamant about what they would do in these situations. But I think that a lot of women are not fully morally culpable for their abortions. And so I think that each one, just like we take each act of killing outside the womb on a case-by-case basis, I think we would need to take each act of killing or neglect inside the womb on a case-by-case basis. In fact, before Roe v. Wade was enacted, back when abortion was illegal in the United States, the police would often offer a post-abortive woman immunity if she gave up the name of her abortionist. And that was in the interest of frying the bigger fish, of ending the abortionist from performing any more abortions, rather than necessarily punishing every single woman who has an abortion. And so I think that if we were to make abortion illegal, it would probably go back to that kind of system again. Okay? And then real quick, I had another question over here, and then we'll come back to you.
One of, I guess, my favorite commentators on culture and society always talks about how, the politics is always downstream from the culture.
Is that John Stone Street?
It is.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with him too, so.
Yeah.
He's actually a friend of my boss, so yeah.
Okay. the legislative battles that are being won, and we're kind of like the pro-life movement. Kind of coupled with the fact that there's been a steady decline since the early '80s in abortion rates in the U.S.
Yeah.
What do you see as being some of those prime movers within American culture that has kind of led to that?
To the decrease in abortions, or? Yeah. Okay. So the question is basically we've been seeing a decline in the number of abortions. What do I see as the reason as the cause for this decline? And again, I think it's a number of factors. Yeah. So first, I'll address what a pro-choice person might say, because I think that there's more to it than that. That a pro-choice person would say, well, it's the availability of contraception that leads to a reduction in abortion rates. But the problem with that kind of argument is that contraception has been widely available for a long time, and so even before the abortion rate started declining, there was still, contraception was still widely available everywhere. And so it wasn't. I don't think it was the availability of contraception. Plus, the availability of contraception actually feeds a reproductive mentality that you're going to have more sex, thinking that you're having safer sex, and that's going to lead to more pregnancies because there's more sex being had. And also, it really feeds a mentality. This is something that Anne Ferretti, who's actually a British pro-abortion advocate who works at a